Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra and these are the key global headlines we are tracking this evening. On her first visit to India as the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen sends a message to China and Russia, calls for efforts to make supply chains resilient through friendshoring, meets Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and visits the Microsoft campus in Noida. Donald Trump and Republicans suffer a blow in the midterm elections. Democrats perform better than expected. Republicans set to retake the House, but with a slim majority. Ukrainian flags fly in Kherson after Russia claims it has completely retreated from the region, says it made the difficult decision to withdraw as Ukrainian troops continued to advance, but maintains the city is still part of Russia. Top executives continue to walk out of Twitter as Elon Musk hints at a potential bankruptcy 2 weeks after taking over the company. Fake Twitter accounts flock to get a blue check, creating chaos for several companies, brands and individuals. Decarbonization dominates discussions in the first week of COP27 summit. US President Joe Biden addresses delegates on day 5. Occidental Petroleum CEO says tackling climate change is the responsibility of individuals, not just the oil and gas industry. It's been a hectic diplomatic week. Negotiations are on at COP27 in Egypt on climate financing and more ambitious targets on reducing fossil fuel consumption. The big warning for world leaders is this: global CO2 emissions are set to increase 1% in 2022 to a record 37.5 billion tons. From Egypt, world leaders, including President Joe Biden and new UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, would be heading to Bali for the G20. Among the expected highlights of the G20, a first in-person meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Ahead of that crucial bilateral, Biden said that he would want to ask Xi Jinping about the red lines in the US-China relationship. Rising tensions due to the Ukraine-Russia war will be a big focus at the G20, and President Vladimir Putin has decided to skip the summit altogether. Instead, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be present in Bali. Ukrainian President Zelensky is set to participate, but virtually. Prime Minister Modi is also flying to Bali on the 14th of November and is likely to have bilateral meetings with key world leaders, including Rishi Sunak. On the last day, Indonesia will be handing over the G20 presidency to India. Let's now discuss the economic and political agenda at this year's G20 in Bali. Joining me now to take this forward is Stephanie Segal, Senior Fellow, Economics Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Also joining us, Roman Kramarchuk, Head of Energy and Policy at S&P Global Commodity. Let me begin with you, Stephanie. Definitely, we're looking at a packed agenda for President Joe Biden. What will be his big pitch at the G20? We have been hearing that he would like to assert U.S. leadership over there.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think in making the trip to Bali, I think the key thing that he can bring is a message of engagement. I think it's important that he's there engaging, obviously, with G20 countries. You mentioned earlier in the broadcast the meeting that'll take place between President Biden and President Xi, demonstrating that fora such as the G20 are actually opportunities to put, as one advisor to Biden has said, put a floor on that relationship. And I think you need to put a floor on the tensions in order to make progress on some of the biggest challenges the world faces, and principal among them climate, which you also referenced. So I think it's also significant that he's headed there, just recently leaving COP27, and will have climate certainly on top of brain, as I think most leaders will.
Right. And we have the COP27 on in Egypt right now, and there will be a lot of takeaways from there, which will be discussed at the G20 as well. Roman, you are joining us from Egypt right now. What is the mood? What is the big message emerging after week 1 of COP27? And what do you think will be the climate priorities at the G20?
I think it's been a very interesting week. I think there are things that we have never heard before spoken actively. Part of that is the idea of loss and damage, which is the idea that the countries that have been responsible for the climate problem until now should be willing to and able to compensate those that are feeling the impact. That's one big thing. Another thing is that's going to be very relevant for the G20 is finance. Interesting that discussions about reforming the multilateral financial institutions have been on the table here. This is something that can carry over into the G20 as well. It's really the story, the interesting thread between COP and the G20. One of the themes of one of the three main pillars of the G20 is going to be sustainable energy transition. And that can't happen unless there are flows of money that actually can decarbonize the sectors where they are growing the fastest. And that really is in the developing world, that's in Africa, that's in South Asia.
Mm. Right. Stephanie, if I can come to you. Today, Janet Yellen was in Delhi and she made a pitch to India about friendshoring, about the need for friendly allies to come together to counter countries like Russia, which are weaponizing trade, weaponizing energy, and also stop over-reliance on China. Do you think that's a priority message that Biden will take to the G20 as well?
I think the message of resilience, which is my kind of understanding of how Secretary Yellen and how the whole friendshoring debate has been framed, is one that I think all countries coming out of the pandemic in the last few years, that message of resilience, including in supply chains, is one that resonates, not just here in the US, but I think globally. I would doubt very much that that is going to be the priority for President Biden at the G20 or for Indonesia as this year's president. I think the focus there will be looking at how all G20 countries can actually contribute to solving some of the biggest challenges. And I don't think supply chain security will necessarily be a focus in G20 discussions, but certainly in the bilateral discussions.
Right. Roman, coming to you about the energy crisis that we are looking at right now, do you think the price cap on Russian oil that has been proposed by the European Union, by the United States, it has not been finalized so far. Do you think there will be pressure to somehow come to an agreement on that at the G20 and also put more economic pressure on Russia?
I mean, if you look at who makes up the G20, there are countries like China, there are countries like India and South Africa that didn't even vote to condemn the Russian invasion in the UN votes. I think it's going to be nearly impossible for the G20 as a group, if they can't agree on such basic premises, to be taking strong steps on elements like the price cap. So the question is, what is it that we may see, and what can people agree? Well, what can the G20 agree on? It could be around dealing with the consequences of that energy crisis. So it could be around, for example, supporting the grain deal and looking to make sure that there is priority on that. The other types of issues that could be agreed upon are, for example, around usage of nuclear weapons. These are the types of things that the G20 as an entire organization can probably agree on. From our perspective, the ability to agree on something as specific and as targeted as the price cap, when you have key members of the G20 that would not be actively supportive of that, is not something that we see coming out of this sort of agreement. So I think that the interesting thing also is, yes.
Right. Stephanie, coming back to President Biden's economic agenda, what are his priorities going to be when he meets world leaders, according to you?
Well, I agree very much with Roman's point that the focus will be on issues and areas where there can be kind of common objectives and agreement. I think responding to the food and fuel crisis is certainly an area where there'll be focus. I think on the grain deal you'd mentioned, I think that's an area, in addition, looking at what some of the multilateral institutions have done in the very near term to respond to the crisis. The IMF has created a new facility specifically to respond to food price shocks. And you'd also mentioned kind of looking at what else the multilateral institutions can do and evolving those multilateral institutions. So I think those will be areas where there is kind of mutual interest among the participants there. One other issue that I expect Biden will push is on debt. This is an issue that has been covered in the past in the G20, but there's been a real lack of progress and an increase in the number of countries that are facing debt distress. So I think there will be an effort to see how the G20 can be used to move that debt issue and debt agenda forward. And it's going to be difficult, but I think the more countries that are in need of relief and assistance, the more energy there will be behind trying to find some solution on these debt overhang issues.
All right, I'll take final questions now with both our guests. Roman, beginning with you, India assumes the presidency of G20 from the 1st of December. What will be the expectation from India when it comes to taking the global economic agenda forward?
I can start with that coming off of, I think when we did a list of the 7 key things to look out for in this COP, what will India do and what will India's position be was among the top 7. India is in a very unique position, both geopolitically, but also in terms of the energy transition, in terms of coal use, in terms of the ability to drive renewables and interest in renewables. I think their position here is going to carry over. It's the point I made earlier that actually finances and the access to finance, the access to developed world contributions to resilience, mitigation, and adaptation, all these things are going to be carried through very specifically at COP, but they're going to be addressed in the G20. And when India is going to have that opportunity, it's certainly there's going to be an energy transition and energy resilience element to things that are going to be critical. I think, you mentioned supply chains earlier, then this is kind of where we see a bit of a fragmentation, but the U.S.'s big Inflation Reduction Act in some ways is reshaping how these relationships will play out. And I think India will have to also deal with the fact that the U.S. will be looking to create that friendshoring. It will be less of a fully multilateral organization because the U.S. is seeking to create those specific supply chains and do industrial policy that way. So I think India has the opportunity to clearly lead on things like energy transition and investment, but they also will face challenges with the U.S.'s Inflation Reduction Act.
Right. Stephanie, one quick question to you. If you had to define one key opportunity for India to make a difference to the global economy during its G20 presidency, what would that be?
Well, I think the prioritization of climate, as we've been discussing, and that consists kind of 2 big pieces, one on the national commitment side and specific and concrete plans for emissions reductions using the G20 to ensure that all G20 countries are in fact making those plans and that they're ambitious. And then the second piece, which Roman also mentioned, is how do we actually get there? And that requires mobilizing trillions of dollars in finance. So Indian leadership on how you do that, both working through the multilateral institutions and mobilizing private capital. I think those are going to be areas that India can work on this year and will be essential for G20 years to come.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephanie and Roman, for joining us, putting the G20 in Bali in perspective for our viewers. We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we take a deep dive into the U.S. midterm polls and how they will impact President Joe Biden's presidency. A special discussion with the former Indian ambassador to the United States, Arun Singh, when we're back.